In this video, we are going to set up the controls for our player, take a look at input actions, and take our first look at the console window. Back in our project, once again, we have our level 1 scene open with our player's representation sitting there. But this is a game and we want our player to be able to do things. We get our art assets to do things by using scripts. We aren't going to make you write any scripts just yet. Instead, we are going to use the ones we created for you. So let's look back into our project tab under Assets, Scripts, Player. We have a controller script. Let's go ahead and attach that through drag and drop to our player, and we can see that the player now has a component on it that is the controller script. We can see it has a bunch of different settings for us to mess with. Right now, I know it isn't set up completely, but let's go ahead and hit play just to see what happens. And as we can test, the player doesn't move at all in response to anything. Neither the W, A, S, D keys or arrow keys do anything. So what gives? Well, when we run into things like this with the script we've imported from somewhere else, we have a few options to debug why it isn't working. If you're a programmer, your first instinct might be to open the script and start reading. But fortunately for us, we don't need to do that, because the majority of the scripts we provided will try to tell you what's wrong with descriptive warnings and errors in the console window. So now we need to know how to open the console window. The fastest way is to click down here on this bar, which shows the most recent console window line. But depending on your settings, that isn't always available. So the other way to get to the console window is the Window, General, Console. So the console window has a lot of options to help you debug. On the top right, there are toggles for the various output types that get sent to the console window, which from left to right are debug output, warnings, then errors. On the top left, there is a clear option that will clear out all output in the console. If you click the drop down, there are options for when to automatically clear, which I like to have all of these checked. Then we have the collapse option, which you can see by these numbers on the right side. This option collapses output that is the same into a single line in the window, and the number is how many times that line has been sent to the console window. The next option is Error Pause, which is useful if you want to be very aware of when errors are happening in your game, so I like to have this on most of the time. But sometimes I leave it off since there are errors that Unity likes to throw that are relatively inconsequential. Last is the editor option that we are going to ignore. Now, let's look at what is actually in our console log right now. First, we have a warning, and then a lot of errors. Almost always when debugging, we want to look at what's at the top first, since issues and errors tend to cascade, meaning that the first problem causes the following problems. If we read this warning, we can see that it says there is no player input manager in the scene. There needs to be one for the controller to work. So this particular warning is generated by the controller script, which we can see if we look here. We've tried to include as many descriptive warnings and errors in our scripts, so as you play around with them, it is easier to figure out what's wrong. So in this case, we see the warning, we know what's wrong, we need a player input manager. Let's look for something like that. In our prefabs folder, we have an input folder, and under that, there is an input manager. So let's try dragging that into our scene. Now let's try going into play mode again. Now if we hit the W, A, S, and D buttons, we can see that the player moves and is receiving input. Without going into detail on how this is all set up, the input manager is basically reading input from devices every frame using the player input component in input actions prefab located in the input folder, which is all its own complicated thing we won't discuss in this project, but we'll get into later. For now, you can play around with the settings on the controller to see how it affects the player's movement.